Have you ever wondered how people in the Middle Ages ate their food without forks? Before the elegance of silverware and fancy table manners, there was a world where hands, knives, and bread were the only tools you needed to survive a meal. Let's travel back to that time, a world ruled by kings, castles, and hunger. The year is 1345. Inside a cold stone castle, the great hall glows with torchlight. Smoke curls up from the hearth, mixing with the scent of roasted meat, baked bread, and sweet wine. Dozens of people sit at long wooden tables, their laughter echoing through the stone walls. But as the feast begins, one thing stands out. There are no forks, only knives and hands. Each guest carries their own knife, a personal blade worn proudly at the belt. It's not just for cutting food, it's a symbol of identity and survival. With that single knife, a noble slices meat, scoops stew, and even spreads butter on his bread. When he's done, he wipes it clean, not with a napkin, but on his tunic sleeve. No one minds. This is how it's always been. Bread, in those days, wasn't just eaten, it served a purpose. A thick, stale slice known as a trencher sat beneath the food like a plate. It soaked up meat juices, grease, and sauce until it became soft and heavy. When the meal ended, it wasn't thrown away. The trencher might be eaten, given to the poor, or tossed to the dogs waiting by the fire. Nothing was wasted. The rich and poor both dined with their fingers, but with different rules. In noble courts, it was considered rude to use all 5 fingers instead. The noble hand was used, the thumb, index, and middle finger only. Those 3 fingers handled bread, meat, and sauce with surprising grace. To lick your fingers or reach across the table was seen as uncivilized. Every movement at the table was a show of manners, status, and control. Meanwhile, far from the castle, peasants lived a simpler life. Their meals were eaten in small, smoky cottages where the air smelled of firewood and earth. A bubbling pot of pottage, a thick stew made of barley, onions, and leftover scraps was often all the family had. Each person dipped from the same bowl with wooden spoons or sometimes bare hands. There were no plates, no cups for everyone. Maybe a shared wooden bowl, maybe a cup passed around. If a crumb fell to the floor, the family dog cleaned it up. That was medieval dining, humble, practical, and raw. Clean water was rare, so washing hands before eating wasn't guaranteed. Instead, people wiped their fingers on bread, their clothes, or whatever was nearby. Hygiene wasn't what we think of today. If someone sneezed near your food, people didn't panic, they said it was God's will. The idea of germs didn't exist yet. Still, medieval people weren't savages. They followed their own version of manners. A guest would never lick his knife, never take food from the communal bowl with a dirty hand, and never insult the host by refusing a dish. Hospitality was sacred, a reflection of character and honor. To dine with someone was a gesture of trust. Drinks were shared freely. Ale, wine, and meat flowed in abundance, and 1 cup might pass between 3 people. Nobody worried about whose lips touched it last. In a world of survival, sharing was a form of respect, and while the nobles dined in splendor, peasants found joy in the simplest meals, bread, cheese, and a warm fire after a long day's work. But somewhere in distant lands, a quiet revolution had already begun. In the grand cities of Byzantium and Venice, strange utensils were appearing, small, 2-pronged tools made of silver. They called them forks. When a Byzantine princess brought these forks to Italy, people were shocked. Priests declared them sinful, saying that God had given humans fingers for eating, and to use a fork was prideful, even unnatural. Europe wasn't ready for the fork yet. To eat with one was seen as vanity, a rejection of divine design. So for hundreds of years, meals continued as they always had, with hands that tore bread, knives that cut meat, and spoons that scooped porridge. Children learned from a young age how to eat properly. By the age of 7, they knew how to use 3 fingers, how to keep elbows off the table, and how to show respect at meal time. To eat well wasn't about what you ate, it was about how you behaved while eating. As the night deepens, the medieval hall grows quieter. The last song fades into the crackle of the fire. Candles flicker, their wax dripping onto the wooden table. Knives are sheathed, trenchers are gone, and guests wipe their hands on their tunics before saying good night. Their stomachs are full, and so are their hearts. Because in this time, every meal, whether fit for a king or a peasant, was a reminder of life's simplicity. No forks, no polished silver, just hands, bread, and faith. And in that ancient rhythm of eating, you can still hear the heartbeat of humanity, raw, humble, and beautifully real. The candles had barely burned out in the halls of medieval Europe when something strange began to appear on noble tables. A new object, small, metallic, and two-pronged, made its quiet entrance. It glimmered in the light like jewelry. People whispered about it, unsure whether to admire or fear it. It was called a fork. At first, it seemed ridiculous. Why would anyone use a tiny metal claw to eat? Wasn't that what fingers were made for? To most Europeans of the 11th and 12th centuries, the fork was a useless luxury. It came from faraway lands, the Byzantine Empire, where gold, silk, and spices were as common as the morning sun. One story tells of a Byzantine princess named Theodora, who married into an Italian royal family. When she arrived at the wedding feast, she shocked everyone. Her servants brought a small golden fork, which she used delicately to eat her food. The Italian clergy watched in horror. One priest stood up and declared, "This woman mocks the hand that God gave her." They said that using a fork was an insult to the Creator, because humans already had the perfect tools, fingers. Word spread quickly. Forks became a symbol of arrogance and vanity. The church condemned them, calling them instruments of pride. People laughed at those who dared to use them. In the streets of Florence and Rome, merchants joked that forks were for the weak, for those afraid to get their hands dirty. But slowly, times began to change. Trade with the East brought more than silk and gold. It brought new ideas, new habits, and new ways of living. In Venice, wealthy merchants saw the fork as a mark of sophistication. A few brave nobles began using them at dinner parties. At first, they were mocked, but the fork's quiet power had already begun. Its work. It started small. Only the richest families owned them. They were made of silver, often carved with delicate designs, and used only for certain dishes. Fruit, pastries, and sticky sweets were considered elegant foods, and forks made eating them easier. Soon, the fork wasn't just a strange tool. It was a fashion statement, a symbol of refinement. To use one meant you had class, money, and taste. By the 15th century, Italy began embracing this new way of eating. The upper class adopted forks during lavish banquets, while the rest of Europe still mocked them. Travelers from England and France who visited Italy wrote about this new eating stick, describing it with amusement and disbelief. One even wrote, "The Italians are so dainty they will not touch their meat with their fingers but use little forks instead." But as centuries passed, Europe's attitude began to shift. New diseases, like the plague, had changed the way people thought about cleanliness. The idea of touching shared food with bare hands began to feel uncomfortable. What was once seen as prideful now looked civilized. People began realizing that maybe the fork wasn't such a bad idea. At first, it spread slowly from Italy to France and from France to England. Royal courts became the center of change. When Catherine de' Medici of Italy married the French King Henry II in the 16th century, she brought her forks with her. The French were fascinated by her elegance, her grace, and her strange eating habits. Soon, French nobles began imitating her style. What was once condemned by priests now became a royal fashion. In England, however, the fork still faced resistance. When a traveler returned from Italy and started using one at dinner, people laughed at him. The English clung to their knives and hands. It wasn't until the 17th century that the fork finally began to win hearts. As dining became more refined, the fork became a symbol of progress, a sign that society itself was evolving. But not everyone accepted it easily. Some men mocked the fork, saying it made people weak and soft. Real men, they claimed, ate with their hands. Forks were for the delicate, for the rich, for those afraid of a little dirt. Still, the movement couldn't be stopped. By the late 1600s, forks had become a staple in the homes of Europe's elite. They grew more elegant, from 2 prongs to 3, then 4. Their shapes adapted to food, and soon every household had them. Even the humble peasant eventually followed, though his fork was simple wood or iron instead of silver. The fork had finally conquered the table. What was once mocked as sinful was now seen as civilized. But the story didn't end there. The fork didn't just change how people ate, it changed how people behaved. Dining became an art form. Etiquette books were written, teaching people how to hold a fork, how to sit, how to serve. The simple act of eating became a reflection of culture and identity. And yet, behind every polished fork lay a history of resistance, pride, and evolution. The people who once tore bread with their bare hands now delicately balanced peas on silver prongs. The world had changed, not because of war or invention, but because of something as small as a tool. The fork, once rejected, had become a symbol of progress. It represented more than refinement. It showed how far humanity could evolve from the chaos of survival to the grace of civilization. And in the quiet of every candlelit dinner, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that first medieval feast, where men and women ate with their hands, laughed with open mouths, and never once imagined that one day the world would bow to the fork. When the fork finally claimed its place on the medieval table, it didn't just change how people ate, it transformed the very meaning of manners. This wasn't just about food anymore, it was about power, about class, about what it meant to be civilized. The story begins in the grand courts of Europe, where nobles gathered for feasts that lasted for hours. Gone were the days of tearing meat with bare hands and wiping fingers on bread. Now, everything had to look elegant, refined, controlled. At first, only the rich understood the silent language of the fork. Every gesture meant something. How you held it showed your upbringing. How you used it showed your status. It was no longer just about eating, it was about being seen. The fork forced people to slow down. Meals that once felt wild and chaotic became choreographed performances. Knives and forks moved in harmony, almost like a dance. Every bite had rhythm, every motion had meaning. The medieval feast was no longer a battlefield of hunger, it became theater. But this quiet revolution didn't happen overnight. Across towns and villages, people resisted change. Farmers and merchants still ate as their ancestors did, with knives and hands. They didn't see the point of prongs and polish. To them, eating was about survival, not show. Still, the wave of refinement crept closer each year. Books began appearing, thick volumes filled with rules of dining. They taught nobles how to sit, how to serve, and how to use cutlery, even how to chew. Suddenly, the dinner table became a classroom of manners. And those who couldn't adapt, they were left behind. By the early 1600s, Europe was divided not by war, but by table manners. Those with forks were seen as modern. Those without were old-fashioned, even barbaric. A new kind of class war had begun, fought not with swords but with etiquette. At royal banquets, servants watched closely. Every noble's hand movement was measured, timed, and expected to be perfect. No clattering knives, no loud chewing, no fingers dipped in sauce. The fork demanded discipline, and discipline defined nobility. Meanwhile, in England, the transformation was slower but inevitable. By the time of King Charles I, forks had become fashionable among the elite, but many still mocked them. The working class held on to their knives and spoons, calling forks foreign foolishness. Even then, it was only a matter of time before the new way of eating spread like wildfire. The Industrial Revolution helped. Factories began producing metal utensils cheaply and quickly. For the first time in history, ordinary people could own what was once reserved for kings. The fork became democratic, a symbol of equality. Everyone could eat like nobility now, but something else was happening too. As the fork spread, so did a new obsession, cleanliness. For centuries, people had eaten communally, dipping their hands into shared pots and drinking from the same cups. Now, the fork created distance. Each person had their own plate, their own utensils, their own space. Meals became personal, private, and polite. The simple act of touching food disappeared from daily life. Children who once played with bread at the table were now taught not to touch anything. Directly, fingers, once symbols of human connection, became signs of bad manners. The fork had quietly changed not just how people ate, but how they thought. This transformation even reached religion and philosophy. Writers of the Enlightenment saw table manners as proof of progress. They believed civilization was defined by restraint, by the ability to control one's instincts even while eating. The fork became a metaphor for self-discipline. It was the tool that separated man from beast. And yet, behind the polished silver, a strange irony remained. The more refined people became, the more distant they grew from their food. Hands no longer touched the meal. The warmth, the texture, the humanity of eating, all filtered through metal. A barrier had been born. Still, the fork had won. By the 18th century, it was an unshakable part of European identity, a sign of culture, modernity, and progress. Across France, England, and beyond, no respectable home would be seen without it. Cutlery became part of social ritual, a quiet code of behavior shared by the entire continent. Even travelers noticed. When European explorers sailed across the world, they brought forks with them, not just as tools, but as symbols of their civilization. In their eyes, to eat with hands was primitive, and just like that, one small invention became a standard of judgment for centuries to come. But deep down, the truth remained unchanged. The fork didn't make humans more refined. It only changed the way they appeared to be. The hunger was still there. The messiness still existed. It just became hidden behind layers of etiquette and steel. By the end of the Middle Ages, the world had transformed. The medieval feast, once loud, raw, and full of life, was now quiet, graceful, and controlled. And yet, somewhere beneath that silence, the echoes of history still lingered. A reminder that once upon a time, people gathered around wooden tables, tore bread with their hands, and found joy not in perfection, but in simplicity. The fork may have changed the rules, but it could never erase where humanity began. The great hall shimmered with candlelight as the evening feast began. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, each one crowded with earthenware bowls, roasted meats, loaves of bread, and pitchers of ale. There were no forks in sight, only knives, spoons, and most importantly hands. The scent of roasted boar and spiced wine filled the air as the guests gathered, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. A minstrel plucked his lute near the hearth, and servants hurried about, pouring drinks and carrying steaming dishes to the tables. This was the heart of medieval dining, loud, messy, and alive. At the high table sat Lord Geoffrey and Lady Eleanor, dressed in velvet and fur, their gold goblets glinting in the flickering light. Even nobles, for all their refinement, ate much like peasants, using their fingers, tearing bread to scoop up stews, and passing dishes from hand to hand. But there were rules to this chaos. A true gentleman would never lick his fingers before wiping them on the communal cloth, nor would he reach across another guest's plate. Cleanliness mattered, at least in appearance, and a man's manners at the table said much about his breeding. The first course began with thick slices of bread called trenchers, used as both plate and utensil. Hot meat or stew was served directly on top, soaking the bread with juices. When the meal was done, the trencher could be eaten, given to the poor, or fed to the dogs waiting eagerly by the benches. Bread was not just food, it was a tool, a vessel, and a sign of how practical medieval life truly was. A good trencher was sturdy enough to hold the feast, yet soft enough to be savoured afterward. As the guests ate, their hands moved, constantly tearing, dipping, sharing. Knives were personal possessions, carried in sheaths on belts. A man's knife was his pride. Some had decorated handles, others plain, but all were kept sharp enough to cut through tough meat. Women used smaller knives, with more grace, slicing delicate pieces for themselves or the children. Spoons were used mostly for soups and pottages, often carved from wood or cast in pewter. Still, most of the meal was enjoyed by hand, with a kind of rhythm and respect learned from childhood. Wine and ale flowed freely, poured into shared cups. It was considered polite to wipe the rim before passing the drink along, though not everyone remembered. At the lower tables, peasants and servants laughed without restraint, sometimes dunking whole chunks of meat into sauces, sometimes eating with their arms resting on the table, something no noble would dare do. Yet despite the hierarchy, food united them all. The act of eating together, without forks or fine manners, made the feast a communal experience, a moment of warmth in a cold world. By the second course, the hall had grown louder. Jesters performed tricks, musicians played faster. and the smell of cinnamon and roasted apples drifted through the air. Lady Eleanor dabbed her fingers in a bowl of rose water, a sweet custom among the wealthy to cleanse the hands between courses. Lord Geoffrey sliced a piece of venison and handed it to the monk seated beside him, a gesture of honor and goodwill. Sharing food was a sacred act. To feed another was to show friendship, respect, even mercy. At one corner of the table, a young squire struggled to carve his portion neatly. His hands, sticky with grease, slipped, sending a bit of meat tumbling to the floor. The others laughed good-naturedly, and a servant quickly swept it away. "Next time, boy," one knight teased, "let your bread do the work." The boy smiled, embarrassed but grateful, learning the ancient lesson that bread, not forks, was the heart of medieval dining. By the time dessert arrived, sweet tarts, sugared nuts, and dried fruits, the hall was glowing with joy and candlelight. Fingers were sticky with honey, lips stained with wine, and the floor littered with crumbs and bones. No one minded. This was how people ate, raw, real, and close to one another. The connection between hands, food, and friendship was unbroken, unpretentious, and deeply human. As the candles burned low and the servants cleared the trenchers, the feast began to fade into songs and stories. The clatter of knives gave way to laughter, and the scent of roasted meat was replaced by the sweet smoke of torches. No one missed forks. They had their hands, their bread, and each other, and in that simple act, sharing food by touch, the medieval world found a kind of beauty modern times would forget. Change in the medieval world never arrived quietly. It crept in slowly, whispered through trade routes, carried in merchant wagons, and spoken about in courts long before it touched the lives of common people. The fork so small, so strange was one of those changes that began not with farmers or knights, but with nobles and travelers who had seen the world beyond Europe's borders. No one in a humble village had ever thought to pierce their food with metal tines. Hands worked just fine, but in the palaces of Italy and Byzantium, something new was beginning to shimmer beside the spoons and knives. It was the 11th century when stories first spread about a Venetian noblewoman who scandalized her new husband escort by bringing a golden fork from the East. She used it delicately, pricking small bites of food and lifting them to her mouth without ever dirtying her hands. The priests whispered that it was sinful that God gave humans fingers to eat with, not to imitate angels. Some even said forks were instruments of vanity, an insult to the divine design. But slowly, ever so slowly, the idea took root. Cleanliness was a virtue, and grace at the table marked refinement. In the great halls of Italy, the wealthiest families began to adopt the fork as a symbol of elegance. At first, they were awkward. Things two-pronged, curved like tiny pitchforks made of silver or brass. Servants stared in confusion, unsure how to serve meals to their masters now that hands were forbidden. The nobles themselves were not much better, dropping food, fumbling with their new utensils, and laughing at their own foolishness, yet they persisted. Civilization, they said, required the taming of instinct, and the fork was a weapon in that battle between wildness and grace. By the 14th century, forks began to appear at royal banquets in Florence and Venice. Painters immortalized them in frescoes, showing noble women dining with elegance while peasants still tore meat with their fingers. Outside the castle walls, in those images, the fork was not just a tool, it was a declaration of status. To eat without touching one's food was to prove that one did not work with their hands, that one's life was devoted to thought, art, and refinement. The hand, once the proud symbol of human survival, was slowly being replaced by polished silver. Still, in most of Europe, the fork remained an oddity. French knights mocked the Italians for their dainty manners, calling them effeminate for fearing a little grease on their fingers. English lords sneered that real men ate with their hands. Let the Italians prick their food, one traveller wrote. We have teeth enough to do the job, but time has a way of dulling pride. When Catherine de' Medici brought her Italian habits to the French court in the 16th century, she carried more than perfumes and fine dresses, she brought forks. And when France embraced something, the rest of Europe eventually followed. At first, only the elite dined with forks, while peasants continued their centuries-old habits, dipping bread into stews and tearing meat apart with skillful fingers. But slowly, merchants, scholars, and travellers adopted the trend, bringing forks from Venice and Florence to Paris, London, and Prague. The utensil evolved, its tines grew longer, its curve gentler, its handle more balanced. By the Renaissance, using a fork was no longer strange. It was sophisticated. It was modern. Yet even as forks spread, there were those who resisted. Some priests still warned against the devil's prongs. Some soldiers laughed at nobles struggling to spear a piece of meat instead of gripping it with strength, but the tide had turned. Cleanliness, elegance, and order had triumphed over the raw, communal, hand-fed chaos of the old feasts. The fork had arrived to separate people from their food and, in some ways, from one another. But for all its polish, something was lost too. The connection between hand and meal, the shared bread torn and passed along the table, the warmth of touch and trust that began to fade. Where once food was a shared experience, it was now a performance of etiquette. The table, once a symbol of unity, became a mirror of class. The fork, in all its silver gleam, had changed not just how people ate, but who they believed themselves to be. And so the age of hands gave way to the age of manners. The old trenchers disappeared, replaced by porcelain plates. The laughter of feasts grew quieter, replaced by the soft clink of utensils. But somewhere in the kitchens and cottages of medieval towns, peasants still dipped bread into broth and tore meat apart, with their bare hands holding on to the oldest truth of all that food tastes best when shared, when touched, when lived. By the late Middle Ages, eating was no longer just a necessity, it was a statement of wealth, of power, of refinement. The dining table had become a stage, and every meal a performance. Gone were the days when knights gnawed on bones and peasants shared a wooden bowl. In the great halls of Europe, everything was arranged with precision. Golden goblets gleamed under candlelight, embroidered napkins lay folded like art, and servants moved silently, trained in the choreography of service. The fork had now taken its place, beside the knife and spoon, transforming the act of eating into a ritual of elegance. Every motion, how one held the utensil, how one cut bread, how one lifted wine to their lips, spoke of upbringing and class. To eat was to display control, manners, and knowledge of invisible rules that separated the noble from the common. The dining hall became a silent battlefield where reputation was won or lost over a piece of meat. Etiquette books began to appear, teaching nobles the proper way to behave at the table. Do not lick your fingers, one manual warned. Do not use your knife to carry food to your mouth. Do not lean upon the table or reach across another's plate. The fork, once scorned as unnecessary, became the centerpiece of refinement. To fumble with it was shameful. To use it with grace was power, and those who mastered it found doors opening in courts and salons, where the slightest misstep could ruin one's standing. But this transformation wasn't just about manners, it was about control. The upper class began to associate cleanliness and restraint with moral superiority. The peasant, who still ate with his hands, was seen as uncivilized, even animalistic. Touching food directly became taboo in noble circles. The same hands that tilled fields or forged iron were deemed too impure to share a meal with the elite. In this way, utensils like the fork didn't just change eating habits, they reinforced social hierarchies. At banquets, food itself became part of the theater. Chefs, once humble cooks, turned into artists of display. Roasted peacocks were brought to the table ray-dressed in their feathers, swans presented with golden crowns, pastries shaped like castles or mythical beasts. Nobles would eat daintily with their forks while minstrels sang and jesters performed, creating a spectacle of taste and wealth. To eat was to be seen. To dine elegantly was to prove that one belonged to a higher world. Yet behind the grandeur, there was unease. The more people distanced themselves from the rawness of food, the more artificial dining became. The table that once united friends and family now divided them by rank and etiquette. Servants stood silent in corners, watching their masters eat but never tasting a bite themselves. The warmth of shared meals had been replaced by the cold choreography of ceremony. Still, for the wealthy, the table was everything, a place where alliances were forged, marriages arranged, and politics disguised as hospitality. A well-hosted banquet could elevate a noble's reputation for months. A single etiquette mistake could become gossip that spread across kingdoms. People practiced their table manners like actors rehearsing for a play, each fork placement, each gesture, a line in a script of sophistication in these halls. The fork became a symbol not just of civilization, but of identity. It separated us from them. It was a small piece of metal that carried centuries of meaning, cleanliness, power, class, control. The medieval meal had evolved from a messy, communal feast into an elegant ritual of hierarchy. But while nobles perfected their performances, the rest of Europe still lived another reality. In villages and cottages, meals were humble and shared. Bread was broken, soup was passed, and fingers were still the first and most trusted tools. No silver gleam, no choreographed dining, just warmth, laughter, and survival. And as history would later prove, those humble tables, those shared, messy meals were the ones that truly kept the world fed. For centuries, the fork remained a luxury of nobles and the elite, the peasants, farmers, and townsfolk who formed the backbone of medieval Europe continued to eat much, as their ancestors had simply, with hands, knives, and spoons. Bread was their plate, their napkin, and often their utensil. The arrival of the fork in common households didn't happen overnight. It trickled down slowly, quietly, carried by merchants, travelers, and whispers of refinement from royal courts. The late Middle Ages saw trade routes expand, connecting Europe with the East. With the spice trade came silks, gems, and subtly new customs. Venetian traders returning from Byzantium or the Ottoman Empire brought tales of people who ate with two-pronged instruments. These stories intrigued some, amused others, and offended a few who thought it was arrogance to separate oneself from the touch of food. Still, curiosity spread faster than condemnation. Forks began appearing in markets not as golden luxuries, but as modest iron or wooden tools affordable to the upper middle class. At first, commoners were hesitant. Using a fork seemed pretentious, even foolish. Hands had always done the job well enough, and bread made a perfectly fine scoop. Why change centuries of habit? But practicality eventually won. The fork made it easier to eat hot food without burning one's fingers. It made shared meals cleaner and safer, reducing the spread of illness, a truth that would become especially clear after the Black Death. Slowly, the utensil of the noble table found its way into taverns, workshops, and family homes. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the fork was no longer an object of ridicule, it was a mark of rising status. To own one meant you were moving upward, aspiring to the refinement once reserved for lords and ladies. The middle-class merchants, scribes, and educated craftsmen embraced it as a symbol of progress. Dining became more deliberate. Meals that were once eaten from shared bowls began to be served on individual plates. The table was transforming from a communal experience into a personal one. This change also reflected a deeper shift in society. Europe was emerging from the shadow of feudalism. Towns were growing. Education was spreading. People began to think of themselves not just as peasants or serfs, but as individuals. And with that change came the desire to eat, act, and live like individuals. The fork, in its quiet way, became part of that identity, a small emblem of modernity. But even as it spread, resistance lingered. Some clergy still denounced the fork as an instrument of vanity. God gave us fingers, one priest famously wrote. Why insult his design with metal claws? Yet, those words carried little power in a world that was hungry for progress. The fork represented something more than convenience. It was civilization itself taking root in everyday life. In England, adoption was slower than in Italy or France. The English pride in simple manners made them skeptical. Even as late as the 1600s, travelers from the continent mocked the English for eating with their fingers. But eventually, practicality overcame pride. By the dawn of the Renaissance, forks were common across Europe, not just at royal banquets, but at wedding feasts, town fairs, and humble family dinners. It was in these modest homes that the fork's true legacy took shape. No longer a symbol of luxury, it became a tool of togetherness. Families sat at wooden tables, children learning how to hold the strange little utensil, laughter filling the air as someone inevitably dropped theirs or poked too hard. The ritual of dining became gentler, cleaner, and more respectful. The act of sharing food, once rough and communal, was evolving into something personal, yet still full of connection. The fork had finally fulfilled its destiny. Born from the courts of empires, ridiculed by priests, embraced by nobles, and at last accepted by the people, it had changed the very rhythm of daily life. The medieval world had stepped closer to the modern one meal at a time. And yet, something precious still lingered in the old way, the warmth of touch, the intimacy of breaking bread with bare hands. The fork hadn't erased that spirit. It had refined it. Humanity was learning to balance grace with simplicity, progress with tradition. In that delicate balance lay the true story of how medieval people learned to eat without losing the soul of their table. As the fork made its quiet entrance into medieval and early Renaissance dining halls, something remarkable began to happen. People started to change not just how they ate, but how they behaved while eating. Before this shift, meals were loud, messy, and deeply communal. Hands tore bread, knives scraped wooden platters, and gravy ran freely down wrists. But with the fork came precision, control, and a new sense of civility that would shape the etiquette of future centuries. At first, this transformation was subtle. The presence of a fork demanded smaller portions, cleaner cuts, and careful coordination between hand and utensil. Food could no longer be simply grabbed. It had to be lifted, speared, and balanced. This required patience, posture, and awareness. Suddenly, dining wasn't only about satisfying hunger. It became a performance, a reflection of refinement. The act of eating began to separate the civilized from the uncouth. In noble courts, this new behavior was celebrated as sophistication. Italian nobles, especially in Venice and Florence, were among the first to develop rules of decorum around the table. Guests were expected to chew quietly, to refrain from speaking with full mouths, and to keep their hands and sleeves clean. In France, Catherine de' Medici would later bring these customs with her when she married into French royalty, spreading Italian dining habits and the fork across Europe. By the late 15th century, the fork had become a symbol of grace. To know how to use it properly meant you were educated, well-bred, and worldly. The upper classes even began writing books on table manners. These guides instructed readers not to blow on hot food, not to lick knives, and not to reach across the table. They emphasized restraint and order, values that reflected the broader changes sweeping through society as feudalism waned and Renaissance ideals rose. Meanwhile, in taverns and peasant homes, the change came more slowly. Old habits lingered. Bread trenchers still soaked up stew, and fingers still served as nature's utensils. Yet even there, the idea of proper eating began to spread. Young men who worked in cities or served in noble houses brought back tales of forks, plates, and napkins. Gradually, these customs trickled down into everyday life. The fork became a quiet teacher of patience and precision. Dining itself grew more ritualistic. Tables were covered with cloths. Food was served in courses rather than all at once. Guests waited for the host to begin before eating. Even prayer at the table took on new importance, marking the meal as both physical nourishment and spiritual reflection. What had once been a chaotic feast was evolving into a graceful ceremony. The birth of table manners as we know them. And with manners came symbolism. The table became a place where social order was visible, where the rich demonstrated refinement, and the poor aspired to it. A noble's worth was measured not only by wealth or lineage, but also by behavior. Cleanliness, courtesy, and composure became virtues in this new world. To be well-mannered was to be civilized. The fork, in this sense, became more than just a utensil. It was a quiet revolution in metal form, a tool that taught humanity how to move with intention, how to eat with grace, and how to share space with dignity. It bridged the gap between hunger and harmony, turning the simple act of eating into an art. By the dawn of the 16th century, the transformation was nearly complete. Across Europe, from Italian palaces to English manors, the once controversial fork had reshaped the culture of the table, and with it, the very definition of what it meant to be polite, refined, and human had evolved. The fork had done more than change meals, it had changed mankind. For medieval people, food was never just food, it was faith, community, and survival woven together. Every meal carried deep meaning, shaped by religion and the rhythm of the seasons. Whether one sat at a peasant's rough-hewn table or a noble's grand feast, eating was a sacred act, bound by custom, gratitude, and divine purpose. In those times, Christianity guided almost every aspect of life, and eating was no exception. The church dictated not only what could be eaten, but when and how. Days of fasting were common, nearly half the year for the devout, when meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. Fish, however, was permitted, which is why medieval Europe became obsessed with rivers, ponds, and salted cod from the sea. Monks perfected fish preservation, and coastal towns thrived by supplying it to inland monasteries and cities. To eat was to obey, to sin or to show devotion. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, so overeating was condemned unless, of course, it happened at a royal banquet. The irony wasn't lost on the poor, who often starved while nobles dined on roasted swan, spiced venison, and pastries filled with fruits from distant lands. Yet even in the grandest halls, food carried religious symbolism. Bread represented the body of Christ, wine his blood, and salt his purity. A meal began with prayer and ended with thanksgiving, a daily ritual of faith expressed through flavor. Feasting, meanwhile, was its own kind of worship. The great halls of castles would glow with candlelight, banners, and laughter. Long tables groaned. Under the weight of meats, stews, and sweetmeats, servants moved like shadows, pouring ale and wine, while musicians played and jesters entertained. These banquets were more than indulgence. They were politics, displays of power and generosity. The more one fed their guests, the more respect and loyalty one earned. At the other end of society, the peasant's meal told a story of endurance. Bread made from barley or rye, pottage thick with vegetables, and maybe a small piece of salted meat or cheese were daily staples. Yet even the humblest meal was eaten with reverence. A loaf of bread might bear a cross carved on its crust before baking. The first bite could be offered to God, the second to the household spirits for protection. Every crumb mattered. Eating together created bonds stronger than words. Families sat side by side, sharing from a single bowl. In towns and villages, community feasts marked every season, harvest festivals, saints' days, weddings, and baptisms. These gatherings reminded people that survival was a shared effort. One person's bread might fill another's bowl, and in that sharing, humanity found its heart. Monks, too, played a major role in shaping how people ate. Inside monastery walls, silence often reigned during meals. Instead of chatter, scripture was read aloud. The brothers would eat slowly, mindfully, as if each mouthful was an act of meditation. This spiritual discipline, born in monasteries, would later influence noble dining, turning the simple act of eating into a reflection of inner virtue and self-control. In many ways, food mirrored the medieval worldview. Life was fragile, uncertain, and deeply dependent on God's mercy. A poor harvest could mean starvation. A feast could mean divine favor. Every meal reminded people of their place in the grand order, God above, kings and nobles below him, peasants and serfs beneath them, all bound by hunger and hope. Yet even through hardship, people celebrated. They sang at tables, broke bread with strangers, and found joy in shared moments of warmth and nourishment. Food was faith made visible, a daily miracle that united all classes, from the humblest shepherd to the mightiest lord. So when we imagine medieval people eating, without forks, it wasn't just messy, it was meaningful. Their hands didn't just feed their bodies, they connected them to the divine, to each other, and to the unspoken truth that every bite was a blessing. As Europe stepped into the later Middle Ages, the world of dining began to change. The fork, that curious, two-pronged tool once seen as foreign and even sinful, slowly made its way into noble courts and wealthy homes. Its arrival didn't just transform the way people ate, it symbolized the shift from a rough, communal age to one striving for elegance, refinement, and control. The earliest forks came from Byzantium, carried west by merchants, travelers, and brides from noble Eastern families. At first, Europeans viewed them with suspicion. Too many, eating with anything. But the fingers God gave was an act of arrogance. The church even condemned the fork as a diabolical luxury, believing it insulted God's creation. But time and trade changed everything. As silk, sugar, and spices traveled across the Mediterranean. So, to did new ideas, including how to dine like royalty. Italian nobles were among the first to embrace the fork. Their tables glittering with silver and glass, the utensil became a mark of sophistication, used by those who wished to distance themselves from the old, messy habits of communal eating. To dine with a fork was to be civilized, clean, and fashionable. Soon, French and English aristocrats followed, though many still mocked the Italian manner as overly delicate. Yet, as history would prove, refinement always finds a way to spread. The introduction of the fork changed everything about the dining experience. Plates became individual instead of shared. Meals slowed down, transforming from a hurried necessity into an art form. New table manners were born. How to hold the utensil, how to cut meat properly, when to sip wine. Even the posture at the table began to matter. Eating became a performance of grace and control, a mirror of one's education and status. But not everyone welcomed the change. The common folk who ate with spoons, knives, and fingers saw no need for such luxury. For centuries more, peasants would continue to share bowls of stew and tiered bread by hand. Forks remained symbols of wealth, glinting on tables only of those who could afford to care about etiquette. The fork's rise coincided with the broader awakening of Europe, the Renaissance. As art, science, and exploration flourished, so did the culture of refinement. Kitchens grew more organized, recipes became written art, spices were no longer just preservatives, but instruments of taste. Food was no longer only survival, it was identity. By the 17th century, what once had been mocked was now essential. The fork, once called unnecessary, became the hallmark of modern civility. The medieval world of rough wooden tables, shared bowls, and greasy fingers slowly faded into memory. In its place came the candlelit tables, silver cutlery, and quiet manners that defined early modern Europe. And yet, something was lost to the intimacy, the shared warmth of communal eating. The sense that a meal was not just about food, but about survival together. The fork separated hands from food, and in doing so, perhaps separated people a little from one another. Still, progress marched on. The utensil that began as scandal became civilization's standard. From the grand feasts of Florence to the humble taverns of London, the fork stood as a symbol of a changing world, one learning not just to eat better, but to live with order and grace. So when you lift a fork today, you're holding more than metal, you're holding history, a story of resistance, transformation, and the endless human desire to refine even the simplest act, the act of eating. As the echoes of the medieval dining halls faded into history, what remained was more than just the memory of rough tables and shared bowls. It was a legacy, a story of how humanity learned to turn necessity into ritual, survival into culture, and eating into an art. The medieval way of dining, though primitive to our eyes, laid the foundation for how we connect through food even today. The simple act of sharing a meal in the Middle Ages carried a weight far greater than we might imagine. At a time when life was uncertain and hunger a constant threat, the table became a sacred space. To eat together was to trust, to build alliances, to form families and communities. Food was not only nourishment, it was loyalty, safety, and belonging. When lords and peasants gathered to eat, they may not have shared the same dishes or comforts, but they shared the same human need, the need to eat and endure another day. Many of the customs we follow today were born from those early tables. The order of serving food, the hierarchy of who eats first, the blessing before a meal, all stem from medieval dining practices shaped by faith and rank. Even the very idea of a dining table as a place of ceremony, rather than mere function, comes from that era. The table was not just furniture, it was the center of life. And though medieval meals lacked our modern utensils, they were rich in flavor and symbolism. Every dish told a story of the land it came from, the hands that made it, and the people who shared it. Bread was not simply food, but a sign of unity. Ale and wine were the blood of the earth, connecting labor to celebration. Spices, once worth their weight in gold, were treasures that spoke of trade, conquest, and curiosity about the wider world. Over time, as forks, fine china, and elaborate etiquette took over, the raw heart of medieval dining softened into refinement. But something profound endured, the sense that food connects us. Every time a family sits down together, every festival meal, every shared bite between friends carries a whisper of that medieval spirit. It reminds us that, beyond class, wealth and manners, the act of eating is the great equalizer. We all gather. We all hunger. We all share. The medieval people may not have had forks, but they had something deeper, a connection to the food they ate and the people they ate with. They understood where their bread came from, how their ale was brewed, how their animals were raised. Their meals were not distant products from faraway factories. They were part of life's daily rhythm, a reminder of the earth's gifts and the community's labor. As we sit at our modern tables, surrounded by stainless steel and electric light, it's worth remembering that the essence of dining hasn't changed. Whether in a medieval hall lit by torches, or a modern kitchen glowing with LEDs, the table is still a symbol of togetherness. It's where stories are told, laughter shared, and hearts mended. So, next time you pick up a fork, think back to those who ate without one, the medieval men and women, who built the foundations of our food culture. They showed us that even in times of darkness, warmth could be found in the simple act of breaking bread together. Their hands may have been rough, their tables simple, but their hearts were full. And from those humble beginnings, the way we eat, gather, and celebrate today was born. The medieval table may be gone, but its spirit still lives on in every meal, every family. Every shared moment where food becomes more than sustenance, it becomes a bond.